Well, welcome, Mr. Kendall, to the interview. It's great to have you on. So, you are the former president of Pinterest, the former Facebook director of monetization, and now the current current CEO at Moment, which is basically an app that keeps people off their phones. So, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, I just wanted to make this clear with all of our listeners. So I know what monetization is personally, but I just want to make sure our listeners know what it is. So what did you do at Facebook as the director of monetization?
Yeah, well, I came in when the company was small, both in terms of employees, but also users. There are probably a couple million, more than a couple, probably 5 or 6 million users, and about 100 employees. And it wasn't really clear at this point, this was almost 15 years ago, how they were going to make money. And they, for some reason, I say for some reason, because it's not like I was uniquely qualified to do the job, but they hired me to come in, look at the business, meaning look at the service, like how are users using the service? And on the basis of that, come up with a bunch of hypotheses for what sort of business revenue source there might be for Facebook. And so I spent, joined in 2006, spent the first year looking at different ways that the business could make money. And then we settled on advertising. And so I spent the balance of my time there building out and scaling that revenue source.
That's very fascinating.
That's great. So when did you realize how much effort goes into keeping people on their phones? And what was your reaction?
Well, in a sense, I knew when I joined the company that there was a lot of effort put into making Facebook, we use the word engaging, right? But we knew that, and there was a lot of effort in building the product, and the product was in fact an engaging product. And so I guess the answer is I realized right when I joined that that's what the business was that we were in. I think what I didn't realize is that because of sort of the all-knowing and progressive way that the algorithm got smarter and smarter and smarter, that we were going to kind of end up in the situation that we're in today. It's not like what Facebook is doing or has done is fundamentally so different than what you all do on your podcast. I mean, your media, your form of media, and you're supported by advertising, right?
Yes.
And so that's what Facebook is. It's media, it's supported by advertising. The difference is that they've used technology to come up with 3 billion Taylors and Maddies to talk to people in a way that's super engaging. So they have 3 billion listeners.
So yeah, it definitely sounds really fascinating that it's basically like media, the podcast, and the news media in general. It's kind of the same way that they make money, but it's like, the difference is that there's a person managing that advertising and there's an algorithm managing that advertising.
Well, there's, and I think maybe more importantly, there's a person who figures out what to talk about on CNN, right? Somebody curates the programming based on what they think the whole audience is going to want to hear. In this case, that sort of curation and programming selection is done on the fly in a very personalized way at Facebook. So in a sense, it's like, by the way, I think the problem here is the business model combined with the all-knowing algorithm, but it's not like Facebook is evil for choosing advertising as the business model. I think what's different about Facebook and really any of these companies in this category that I'll call sort of big social. I call it big social because it's like, it's another version of an industry that I think takes advantages of its consumer to profit in the way that big oil took advantage of the consumer, big tobacco and big sugar, and now we've got big social. I think what makes big social unique is that these algorithms, they've come up with sort of the drug that will just keep people coming back and will be more and more addictive each and every day. And because it's sort of, that algorithm develops and grows in an unsupervised way, it starts to do things that people can't predict and that lead to unintended consequences. The best example of that, there are lots of examples of that, but the best example of that is that the algorithm has actually figured out that if, Taylor, you're on the left, you're a liberal, I'm a conservative, it actually has figured out that if it can create a wedge between us and push us further apart, sort of imperceptibly over weeks and months and years, we are both more engaged in the service because we're more radicalized, we're more extreme, we're more likely to think that we're right, that the other is wrong. So I'm more dug in on my stance on the right, and you're more dug in on your stance on the left. And we are both in this like self-righteous, angry cycle of just getting more and more radicalized and angry. And that's really good for business. But it's not like Cheryl and Mark said, hey, come up with a great idea. Let's throw a wedge between Taylor and Tim and we'll make a lot of money. Right? Instead, it's like, let's give this really smart algorithm that we're not going to supervise because it's really hard to understand exactly what it's doing. Let's just give it an objective, which is get Taylor and Tim to spend as much time as possible. Go. And that's one of many things that it figured out. And that's the unintended consequence that the film obviously highlights, and that we now as a country and a world are facing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That was one of the last points of the social dilemma itself. It basically showed this graph of the polarization of the world. You have the left over here, you have the right over here. That's one of the reasons that we use the term left and right. They're so opposite now. So that's what's really fascinating about it. And it's almost scary that if you think about it, an algorithm, they don't know anything about the world itself because it's never actually in the physical world. So they don't really know much about emotions. But if you give something that's, so to speak, outside the world and objective like that, it figured out that the best way to keep someone engaged is to make them angry. So that's honestly very disturbing to a lot of people. I think that's why a lot of people have a problem with social media.
Yeah. Well, and it's again, I don't give this example to let Facebook off the hook, but they're not the only ones that figured that out. Fox and CNN have figured that out too. Like their business, and MSNBC, their business is just to basically confirm your view and make you angry at the other side.
That is very fascinating. I do wonder though, is that basically a product of what social media has done? Because you have the left and the right. So it could be the fact that social media has created, so to speak, CNN and Fox, and they're just going off of that. Or as you say, that's their business model.
Yeah. I mean, what I suspect, and I don't know the answer to this, but I have read some research about where we start as a culture, we started to become divergent in a way that you just didn't see 30, 40 years ago. And a lot of it does trace back to the beginning of cable TV, which is when sort of we decided, you being on the left, me being on the right, decided to get our news and facts from different sources. I don't think it was nearly as pronounced as what we see today when we watch either of those channels. So I don't think that Facebook invented the wheel. I think in a sense, sort of cable TV did. But I think that social media has just accelerated this to a pace and a volume that's really troubling.
So I'm switching gears a little bit, and I definitely agree with what you're saying. So another big aspect that the social dilemma kind of starts off with is how, well, social media itself affects, and social networking affects the people who are on it, who use it a lot. And it seems to say that it breaks away from the deep relationships that a lot of people have. So I am very curious, what was your reaction when you started seeing that it has like an effect on everyone who uses it itself, basically a negative effect?
Well, I don't think it's so clear that it's like all negative. I think it's a mixed bag. I think in the last few years, and I don't have data to support this, this is just, you know, arguing from anecdote, it does seem like there's more negative that's coming out of these services than positive. I mean, a big reason why I left, you know, sort of big tech and started working on Moment was that I was really concerned that these big social services on our phones were taking over our lives, and that we were sort of losing our agency. We were kind of losing control of the phone. And I really felt like I needed to do something to sort of push back against that trend, and ideally provide tools, a set of tools that people could use to get back control. And so when I first started to realize just how little control we had, and that it was affecting families and teenage mental health, et cetera, I felt scared, guilty, upset. And it wasn't a single point in time. It happened over years. I think I really started thinking about this probably 4 years ago when I started to think about how our phones were sort of soothed us in the same way the cigarette used to soothe people, right? You just kind of pull it out when you're waiting in line, or, you know, when you're bored, when you're sad, when you're depressed, when you're lonely. And I think, referring to an earlier point that you made, one of the things that I'm particularly troubled by is that I think a big reason why some people get on their phones is that they feel lonely. One of many reasons, but there is a use case, right, where I feel lonely. And I think, well, my friends are on social media, so I pick this up. And I think what you were saying earlier is that the interactions just inherently don't have a lot of depth or meaning. They don't really, they don't contain the dynamics that we see in a normal dialogue like this, or an in-person interaction. And so it sort of presents this kind of false antidote to loneliness. It's like, well, I'm lonely, so I need to be around people. Well, I can be around a lot of people on Facebook, so I'll go on Facebook. And what does Facebook do? Well, Facebook throws popularity at me and comparison at me and vanity and voyeurism and all these things that actually don't make me feel that good. And by the way, at the end of that, I'm worse off. I'm still just as lonely. And now I'm, you know, kind of bummed out, maybe a little anxious. And so one of the things that, you know, we work on at Moment, and we're still sort of in the prototype phases of this, is like, how do we help people understand and guide them towards, when they are lonely, to not necessarily be on social media, but instead to call a friend, but instead to have a substantive interaction with a family member. And so we're trying to figure out if that's something you can build into a product that does that, and also, you know, limits the universe of people that I interact with to something a little more realistic, like the 5, 10, 15, 20 people that really matter to me, that I really care about and love. The part of the problem with the advertising business model of social media is that their incentives are, because they know that if they connect you to more people, you'll spend more time. Their incentives are actually to distribute your attention across all these different people, hundreds, if not thousands of people, many of whom you don't care about. I mean, I sort of joke about, it's not really a joke. It's like, you go on Facebook to learn what friend 734 is eating for breakfast, or what, like, it's just, I don't care what they're doing. And I don't even care about the person. because it's not even the friend graph that really matters to me.
Yeah, you bring up some very fascinating points. As you mentioned at the very beginning, you said that, well, not all of social media's aspects are negative. And I actually really do agree with you. Because during the pandemic, especially, honestly, social media was one of the only social interactions we had.
Yeah.
So that actually showed a lot of the good part of social media. We talked about this with another guest, Dr. Adam Alter, who read about social media and studied about that too. Then also, as you said, social media, the interactions aren't as deep as we would probably want them to be.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I find that very fascinating, honestly.
Yeah. It turns out that, I mean, we study this at Moment quite a bit, like the way that people get close and sustain closeness, human beings, is that it's actually through escalating self-disclosure and reciprocal self-disclosure. And that doesn't happen, right? That's not like this, it doesn't happen in 1 minute, right? Over the course of hanging out for hours and hours, I start to trust you. I start to feel comfortable with you. So I tell you something about myself that maybe I don't tell everybody. And what happens there is you see vulnerability, you see that I trust you. And so there's a reciprocation. And then you tell me something. And there's this back and forth that happens when people sort of study this. And that's what makes people close. And, you know, the current platforms out there do not facilitate that at all. And that's why we often don't feel as close to people when we're just interacting, when we're just sort of liking their content, right? There's nothing sort of vulnerable about that interaction at all. One could maybe argue that posting something about myself is kind of socially vulnerable, but it's not something that's going to actually strengthen a given relationship with one or two or three people that I really care about. I'm curious, what social media tools do you use?
So right now, honestly, Maddie and I, we're not allowed to have social media ourselves. So that's
Right.
kind of funny.
But what did you do during the quarantine? You said without social media, you wouldn't have stayed connected.
Yeah, so a lot of what we use, a lot of our schools have group chats. So we text in there. We have schools. That's another aspect that people don't always, I think about. Instead of sending pictures to social media, they can send it to group chats. That's a lot of what we did.
Yeah.
We had group Zoom
so
calls.
Much better, by the way.
Oh yeah, and then for our podcast, that's the only time we actually have social media. Is basically just to stay connected with our listeners. Because honestly, we don't know our listeners personally, so that's one of the best ways to actually get to connect with them.
Yeah. But in that sense, you're a media company, right? And like you have a business, and that's how media company businesses, podcasts are run, right? There's a social media presence and there's the actual media product, and that makes total sense. And that's interesting. It's terrific that you have a tool that is contained to your school. For now, right? It's just like you get a lot of the good without a lot of the risk of these broader platforms and sort of all the manipulative tactics that they, use, like streaks and viral videos and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So I'm moving on a little bit, and especially since we've talked a lot about time that we spend on our social media. And I've heard statistics ranging from people spend 10 to 6 hours, at least at a minimum, on just phones in general, regardless of social media. Video games, especially my social media and video games, are two of the profound things that people spend all of their time on. So I know that you are the CEO of Moment, and that's kind of what you guys do, is try to cut down on that, on your time on your phone. And like you said, spend deep interactions. So do you have any, besides obviously downloading Moment, do you have any tips for how to stay off your phone?
Yeah, I have a couple. I'll give kind of the basic 101 tips, and then I'll give kind of one advanced tip that I've actually just been playing with personally for a while that I think works pretty well. The basics are, I think people with their families agreeing to a time, limits and boundaries are really important with devices. And so I think agreeing to a part of the house where maybe you don't use devices. Maybe that's the dinner table. Maybe that's the dinner table in the living room and the kitchen. That can work really well. It turns out that when we use these things, it's very contagious. So if there's an area where we don't use it and can't use it, you find that you have less of those moments where you see, oh, my mom's using it, so I'm going to pick it up. And then my sister picks it up, and then my dad picks it up. And then we're that family at the table, all staring at pieces of glass, not talking to each other. So I think that's a good norm and a boundary. Another one is just setting a time, which is, hey, after 8 o'clock, we don't use phones, or between 6 and 7:30, we don't use phones as a family. And then the other thing that's probably the way to move the needle the most, if you're really trying to take your 6 or 8 hours of usage and cut down, is just set a norm, which is easier said than done, that you're not going to bring your phone into your bedroom. Just don't do it. And what that does is it cuts down on 3 of the biggest drivers of time spent, frivolous time spent really on the phone. 1 is when you go to bed. 2 is when you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep. People love picking up their phones, including me. And then 3 is when you wake up, if your phone's right there, you tend to reach for it and can get sucked into something that you don't really intend to get sucked into. It's remarkable when people commit to that bedroom rule and stick to it, how much they're able to reduce their overall phone usage.
You know,
and
that's, yeah, continue. No, you continue.
The advanced tip is probably a way to do it on Android. I don't know how to do it on Android because I have an Apple phone, but you go into screen time, which is in settings, and you set downtime. So when's the time that I really don't want to use my phone? All right, so I'll set downtime between, call it the window we talked about earlier, 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. And then, look, between 6 and 8, I still want to have access to my phone, and I need my calendar, and I want Spotify so I can still listen to music, because those are kosher things to be doing. So I go into always allowed, and I set messaging, phone, calendar, and Spotify as one of my 3 always allowed apps. And then, and this is the real hack, I click change screen time passcode, and then I hand it over to my wife, and I let her change the password so that I don't know it. I mean, for people who are super serious about changing behaviors, you got to get rid of the back door. You got to use your motivation in this very moment. If we're really motivated right now, you got to say, I'm committing, and I'm not going to let myself go back on it. And that little trick with my wife that you can do with your parents or your siblings or your partner, it eliminates that back door. And you're going to have some agonizing moments, but you can guarantee you'll change your behavior. And if you're really committed, that's, and if you study nutrition, this is the way that they change behavior with eating, right? If there's something I really shouldn't eat that I always eat all the time that I just want to stop eating, the tried and true way is to get it out of the house. And that's hard on this thing. But what I just suggested is one way. The other way, which is in the film and something that I'd played with before, is getting one of those kitchen safes where you put the phone in this lockbox and then you turn the top of it to a certain time, and there's no back door. Although they show in the film there is a back door, right? You smash it, but it's pretty hard to do.
And that's also $30 down the drain, or how much exactly. They cost.
It's pricey way to get into it.
That is. So yeah, it's funny. Our families both use the screen time thing, and yeah, you can't get it unless you have that password. Apple's done a great job of that, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
So moving on to the last 2 questions that we have, and we always ask our guests these. And the first question is, what books have had an impact on you and why?
Well, there's a book that I've gotten really interested in Buddhism in the last couple of years. And one of my favorite books that I think is an accessible way to sort of explore Buddhism and meditation you know, I'd say at a high level, not being too attached to how things turn out in your life, is this book called When Things Fall Apart by this woman, Pema Chodron. It's really helped me to, you know, not get too concerned about outcomes, because a lot of them I can't control. And also not to get so fixated on labeling what this moment is all about. Like, is this a bad moment? Is this a good moment? Should I hate this moment? Should I love this moment? She makes this great point that we spend so much time basically seeking out pleasure and avoiding pain. An exorbitant amount of energy doing that in our life. I certainly do that day to day. And she pushes you and gives some frameworks for how human beings might be better served if they could just sit in whatever is this moment, right? And it might be painful, but it happens to be the moment. And so it might be a good teacher for us. It might be a delightful moment. Well, things are ephemeral and short-lived and non-permanent. And so it's going to stop being delightful at some point. So don't get too attached to it. I guess in the same realm, Why Buddhism Is True is another great book. If you're curious about sort of the faith or just the practices, because you don't even have to buy into the faith at all to learn from some of the things that Buddhism, I think, has gotten right about life. So those are two. Do I have to come up with three? You want me to come up with a third?
I mean, you don't have to. We can end it there if you want.
I'm reading Barack Obama's book, which just came out, and it seems good so far. I thought Michelle Obama's book was phenomenal, super inspiring. I mean, what a story.
Yeah, those all sound very interesting. I haven't read any of those in particular. People keep recommending the Michelle Obama book, but I've never read it. And I know that the Barack Obama book just came out. So then our last question is another one that we ask all of our guests. What advice do you have for teenagers?
Oh. Well, I think when I was a teenager, I was really focused on getting on with it, getting on with life, getting on to being a senior, getting on to going to college. And I think in a sense, I've lived maybe too much of my life than I'd like to admit that way, which is like kind of rushing to the next milestone. And I guess I would really encourage teenagers to figure out how the different tools, and there are lots of tools for this, including meditation, including aspects of Buddhism, how I could get myself to be more present in the here and now. Because I certainly, and I still do this, I spend a lot of time, what they call it future tripping, or agonizing over the past. And it's kind of a waste of energy. We're so programmed to do that. So this isn't an easy thing to do. But I do think that when we're really present, God, we're happier. Or at least we're more content and settled. And I don't know, I think I spent a lot of my teenage years just worrying about whether I was going to amount to anything. And I think in a sense, I wasted a lot of time thinking about that and worrying about like, am I doing the right thing? Am I taking the right class? Am I, and there's social versions of that too, right? Am I hanging out with the right group? And I wish if I could go back and give myself advice, I'd tell myself to relax, figure out how to really be in the moment. And then, I think part of what can really help people be in the moment is being grateful for what is and what is now and what do I already have. And I was, it's taken me until pretty recently to realize I'm not that grateful of a person. And I need, and by the way, by being really proactive about trying to point out to myself each and every day what I'm grateful for, that has a nice reinforcing effect. And when you're grateful, you're more present, right? You don't spend too much time thinking about, oh, well, when this happens, I'll be happy, right? Because you're happy now, you're grateful now. So be present, have a gratitude practice. Don't worry too much about how things are going to turn out. You're going to be okay.
So be grateful, be present, and yes, be thankful and be in the moment, as literally the app that you're the CEO of says.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Yeah. It was great having you on.
Yeah, thank you both. It was super fun.